most honest, most intimate friends. Despite the many restrictions of their lives, they all have minds of their own. There are few people whom I really love, and still fewer of whom I think well, says Lizzie Bennet dryly in Pride and Prejudice. Men have had every advantage of us in telling their own story, says Anne Elliot resignedly in Persuasion. The pen has been in their hands. I will not allow books to prove anything. But if you read Jane Austen's private letters and thoughts, you realise that your friend is really the writer herself. And buttoned up or repressed are the very last things she is. Pictures of perfection, she admits, make me sick and wicked. And despite her dependent position in society, she was extraordinarily independent in spirit. I must keep to my own style, she says, and go on in my own way. And though I may never succeed again in that, I am convinced that I should totally fail in any other. Jane Austen's work is sometimes described as double-voiced. On one level, it's sparkling romantic comedy. On another, she was gently altering the way the world would see women. Women like Jane were beholden to their male relatives for everything: money, safety, a home. Women like Jane were left with no option but to believe they had to marry for money. But Jane herself showed that there was a braver way of living: to turn down an offer of marriage, which came with a grand country house, and to try to live instead as a professional novelist. Yet she wasn't a man-hater, far from it. Her leading ladies believe in and hold out for a marriage of love. To marry for money, says Catherine Morland in Northanger Abbey, is the wickedest thing in existence. Once Jane Austen's heroines had shown the world that this was the way things ought to be, her readers began to demand the same. There are lots of books about Jane Austen, but this one takes us deep into something that had huge significance to the writer: her home. If you visit the pretty, flower-filled house at Chawton in Hampshire that finally provided Jane, her sister, and their mother with a long-sought home, it seems rather lovely. Jane moved there in 1809, probably expecting to live there happily until the end of her life. As it turned out, sadly, she would not. And despite all the beautiful Georgian architecture you'll see in the feature films of her books, home for Jane and her closest female relatives was often a much less pleasant place. She occupied a series of small, sometimes rather depressing rooms in houses and flats, and spent a lot of her life scrounging stays with friends or the relatives who used her to provide cheap childcare. For Jane, who had no independent income and whose family would have been aghast if she got herself a job, home was a perennial problem. Where could she afford to live? With all the domestic duties of an unmarried daughter and aunt, how could she find the time to write? Would her precious manuscripts be safe? A home of her own must have seemed to Jane to be always just out of reach. It's not surprising, then, that the search for a home is central to Jane's fiction. The majority of her scenes take place indoors, with people talking, always talking, in a room which is very often a drawing room. And yet, when Jane's characters want to talk about what really matters, their feelings, the truth, they often have to go outdoors. They escape the jaws of the drawing rooms that confine their lives. "You were sick of civility," says Lizzie Bennet in a moment of intimacy with Mr. Darcy. A quick reading of the novels might leave you with the impression that the search for a romantic partner is what matters most. But really, a happy home is equally an object of desire.